I always think that reading from a novel is a really ill-advised thing, because when you write the novel, you really wish to transcend yourself. You don't wish what's on the page to be anything to do with you, in a sense, you know. So and that's the great adventure, and that's what the art's about, surely. And then you read your novel, and then once I loved your reading so much, now I know exactly how to read it and how it will sound. But in fact, I didn't want that at all, because I wanted the voices in your heads, to be free of the way I do this or whatever I do. And however, whatever Oscar Wilde said,
that's a good answer for anything. Just whatever Oscar Wilde said, yeah.
And to make it all a little worse, I'm going to read you from the opening of the book, and the voice is a female voice. So get your heads around that. And
to the Harbour Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
Thanks very much. We did the traditional acknowledgement for, acknowledgement for being on traditional territory. I also feel we should acknowledge that it's going to be two sort of white guys talking about many things, including Indigenous issues. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Peter Carey. Peter Carey is the author of 14 novels, including Oscar and Lucinda and The True History of the Kelly Gang, both of which received the Booker Prize. Among other honors, he has won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and the Miles Franklin Literary Award. He was born in the town of Bacchus Marsh in Australia, coincidentally the same place that the Bobbs family in his new novel call home. And it's a further coincidence that, like the Bobbs family, his parents also owned a car dealership in the town in the 1950s. Peter Carey has, however, lived in the US for many years. In his novel Oscar and Lucinda, we read about the main character's father, Theophilus Hopkins. We learn that you can look him up in the 1860s Britannica, but it does not tell you what he was like. You can read it 3 times and never guess that he had any particular attitude to Christmas pudding. Peter Carey's new novel, A Long Way From Home, doesn't tell us anything about his attitude towards Christmas pudding. But the novel, which he says is the novel he spent his whole life not knowing how to write, explores some of the perennial themes of his writing: parenthood, love, journeys into urban spaces, the bush and the outback, history, legacy, ideology, settler colonialism, immigration, and the nature of power, identity, knowledge, truth, loss, and car dealerships. In many ways, it's a culmination of his previous concerns, but also marks a new concern: a deeply thoughtful and sensitive reckoning with Australia's brutality towards the continent's Aboriginal people. To quote the author, "I'm 74 years old. It's about fucking time I did this. I could have had a heart attack last week or last year or 2 years ago and wouldn't have done it. I prefer to have done it." But the proof is in the pudding. A Long Way From Home is hilarious, moving, and profound, filled with compelling characters and vivid and captivating storytelling. I thought I'd just give you a quick intro to the book, lifted from the publicity materials just to get oriented. A Long Way From Home opens in 1953 with the arrival of the tiny, handsome Titch Bobbs, his beautiful petite wife, Irene, and their 2 children in the small town of Bacchus Marsh. Titch is the best car salesman in southeastern Australia and has an overbearing father. Irene loves her husband and loves to drive fast. Together, they enter the redex trial, a brutal endurance race around Australia over roads no car is designed to survive. With them is their neighbor and navigator, Willie Bachhuber, a quiz show champion and a school teacher who's been fired from his job. He calls the turns and creek crossings on a map and leads them without warning, away from the white Australia they all know. And then, well, I don't want to give away the ending. Let's say the car hits it doesn't hit an iceberg and sink, and they don't drop a ring into a volcano to save the world. But perhaps we can talk about what develops toward the end of the race. I'm truly honored that we have the opportunity to have Peter Carey with us tonight to talk about the book. We'll have a chat. He'll do a couple short readings, and after that, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So please join me now in welcoming Peter Carey.
What I said was a couple of white guys sitting down talking about white colonialism and white murders and white possession of other people's lands. But so I think it has to involve Indigenous people, of course, but it is the story of white Australia and what white Australia did to get there and to be there now.
No, absolutely. And what is the limits of white Australians to understand Indigenous knowing and to Indigenous experience and how to reckon with the past?
It's a huge problem for all of us. And the difficulty, I mean, for a long, long time, let me start with a story. In about 1980-something, I was in a playwrights conference in Canberra, and there was a famous and still kicking Aboriginal activist called Carey on the stage talking to us. Carey was not a warm and cuddly man, but he was an important activist in the Aboriginal cause. And he looked at us all and he said, look, I know you blokes want to help and you'd really like to represent, our cause, and I understand all of that, but you could do me one big favour, and that would be just to not do it. Because we've already got enough crap to deal with anyway. And we've got so much misinformation that we have to sort of get rid of somehow, that's been put there by you guys. And we've got big problems of our own, so why don't you just not do it? I thought that was really absolutely correct. I felt no resistance at that time to that at all. And so for many years afterwards, when I inevitably wrote about Australia, while always acknowledging the sort of awful truth of the beginning of Australia, I never attempted to go further like I have in this book by dramatising it and by having some Indigenous characters and so on. And as you said in your introduction, you get to 70, you're an Australian writer, you've written all these books, about Australia and Ned Kelly and Oscar and Lucinda and colonialism and da-da-da. But you've never actually once really directly addressed the central, seems to me, the pivotal foundation. I mean, the convict colony is a bloody and ugly beginning to a country, and certainly I believe we're traumatised to this day by that. But it sort of pales in significance to the obliteration or attempted obliteration of a 50,000-year-old culture. So I thought that I really had to find a way to do this, because I believe that people like us who write, we do something that most people, even though they might read our books, can't really, unless you do it yourself. It's very hard to cope with the notion of people inventing things that also happen to be really deeply true. And people tend to believe that you know the things you know because you've somehow experienced them or somebody's told you. But there's something else that happens, which I think when a novel works, when we're crossing the sort of chasms that we're talking about here, there has to be a sort of a really bright, empathetic leap whereby the author imagines what it is to be someone totally different. And that's what I think my job is, and that's what I think I should do, and that's what I think all the great writers in history have done. They haven't been going me, me, me. They've been doing bigger, bolder things. And so, on the one hand, you have I mean, if the Aboriginal culture is your culture, and you know these people in this other race invaded your land, murdered your ancestors and your grandfather, and terrorized your father and your mother, and traumatized you, and removed your whole way of life as a possibility. And then the people from the race say, I'm going to write about you, and it's going to be so sensitive, and we're going to make this all right, you know. And now, if you're being spoken to like that, I think the natural response is sort of rage. You know, get out. Don't you dare speak to me. Like, what right have you got? So I think that's a valid position, but I think the other position is also valid. The thing of being able to imagine what it is somehow to be someone else. And I thought that was my job. I thought I was possibly going to be vilified and sort of run out of town in a way. But I thought I really had to try. And in comparison of all the things that can happen to you, so you get vilified. Or what's that in comparison with the whole history of Australia and the things that have happened to people? Sorry, that's a very long sort of ramble. But I was just trying to...
Excellent.
But it's a new sort of ramble. I never actually gave that one before. Yeah.
But I think one of the things that you do in the book, which is that you don't just say, this is what Indigenous experience is.
No.
You say, this is what the limitations of what we can know are. These are the many ways of approaching it. This is what Indigenous people are saying that... how much people can know, and these are the different ways we might approach this very conundrum about knowing the other. So it's not just saying, allow me to white-splain what is going on to you.
Well, firstly, thank you, and that's really what I wanted. But because I'm for all the sort of reckless things I decide in the middle of the night, I'm also quite a cautious person. And always have been in writing about people whose lives and histories are different to my own. So that manuscript went to many Indigenous people who read it. If you think the dialogue's good, well, you can thank them mostly. I mean, the Indigenous dialogue's good. You can thank them mostly for that. So I always found it a great pleasure to give a book to not a literary person, but somebody whose life might be represented in some way in the book. And they're very refreshing and very unexpected, you know, like the Armenian guy and the tax inspector, who was a wonderful man. And he said, well, it's pretty good, what you got. But he said, you know, Armenians have got big noses. You should give them big noses. So they say the most unlikely things. And they do tend to relax you a little bit when you're tiptoeing in your nervous, polite way around things.
I would say also, it was mentioned in the review in the Globe, which was, I thought, a very perceptive review, that at a key moment in the story where you're engaging with an Indigenous perspective, you actually quote an Indigenous oral story.
Couldn't have done better myself. I mean, it's a brilliant story. So the only thing to do was to be a collagist at that particular stage.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about it? It was a Captain Cook saga. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what those things are?
Well, maybe I could, before the Captain Cook, talk about the one of the things I found that leads up to the Captain Cook thing is, you know, I was very worried how, and I approach a novel, you know, believing I'm going to get to where I want to get to, but with so many things unresolved and undiscovered. And if you're going to think about Aboriginal culture, you've really got to think about religion and how you're going to deal with that, white man. You know, it's not, you know, and the seriousness of those rituals and ceremonies and the secrecy of them, and it makes so one of the things that I discovered, which was that unknown to most anthropologists, I believe, was the fact that the Aboriginal people for a long time had been appropriating white stories and had been turning them back and around. Now, Aboriginal people were thought not to invent new elements in you know, religious life. but there was sort of definite religious elements, So there's a fabulous Noah's Ark story. Well, it's not meant to be. The Ark is meant to exist in a particular place in the Kimberleys. It's meant to be there, and it's actually meant to be full of the usual jewels and sort of things. But
they had jewels on the Ark?
Huh?
They were just like paired
jewels.
jewels. Sorry, I interrupted you. So they were Aboriginal Australian had.
And in this Noah's Ark story, all the white people die. And for us who want all things to equal and be just and weird, it's disconcerting to find that when the white people all die, the black people become white. So you don't quite know. It's hard to know how to deal with that in your head, but still, that's part of that story. So there were many stories that were like that. Now, among the anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who collected many of these stories and wrote about them very tellingly and intelligently, also had a long friendship with a man called Hobbles Daniyari, who, if anybody knows anything about Aboriginal resistance in Australia, he was one of the Gurindji men who fought the Vesti Corporation, I think in the 60s. So I was sort of thrilled to find that about him. But there's this lovely long story about Captain Cook, which I won't be able to tell you, but maybe the way to sort of understand it, when I see the story, it's like, before, older Balinese paintings, which often had lots of little figures all over a big canvas. And so if you imagine the Captain Cook narrative sort of being a little bit like that, and so Captain Cook is repeating many actions in the... So the story of Captain Cook is Captain Cook comes and says, "Oh, good, nice country this, think I have that." And he goes there and he makes decisions about shooting people and strangling children and doing this and that. And these things happen all over the country. And it's done with great energy and a sort of a sarcasm. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying sounds just cruel and violent, which of course it is, but there's this other level, which is sort of wicked and funny, and you really see Captain Cook as a murderous figure with his guns setting up and landing in all different parts of Australia, I think I've done something bad here. Oh, no, I haven't. Good. How am I doing? Okay. And that's a fabulous story. So I'm sort of destroying it by sort of not telling it to you.
Well, it is in the book, right?
Yeah,
so
but I'm not going to read it in his voice, because I would destroy it in another way. So, but it's a lovely, lovely story.
It put me in mind of the Canadian Indigenous writer Thomas King, who has some stories. He has some Columbus Coyote story where he takes the coyote figure telling the story of Columbus and he appropriates it and tells it against the standard narrative. The other thing which I think relates to that is, I do want to get to talking specifically about the characters and the plot, but we'll get to that.
Well, there's a big secret. There's a big secret in this book.
There is.
And, the thing is, we're probably not going to tell you, but I'm a little unreliable, so we don't know quite what's going to happen there.
My job is just to lead you on until you accidentally divulge the ending, right? So that's, some people have got money, for me. So I want to talk about the place of maps, because it is a race around Australia, the redex trial. So they have maps. One of the characters, Willie, the Navigator, is an expert or an aficionado of maps, and early in the book he is looking at maps of Europe and poetically imagining his origin, and he has maps of how to get around Australia. But there's also another kind of map, which is an Indigenous map of the land of Indigenous knowing, and there is a kind of writing over of. Yes. So maybe I'll let you decide how much you want to tell of.
How much you want to screw that up, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, the book really began when I thought about the redex trial, and I looked at the old newsreel footage, which I invite you all to look at on YouTube, and you can. It's extraordinary. Now, the whole country's mad about a car race. And the roads are extraordinary, and the dust's everywhere, and cars are being broken, and so on. And I looked at this, and I thought, well, I see this car going up a road. And I thought, if you guys were driving up the aisle of a cathedral, you really wouldn't know it. And maybe, in fact, you are. Because when you think about them with their maps and their strip maps, which all the drivers have, their strip maps ignore the fact that they're driving across a 50,000-year-old culture, a landscape of a 50,000-year-old culture, which is, of course, threaded densely with lines of ritual and ceremony and story, and many of which contain more sort of practical aspects, like knowing where water holes are and things like that. But if you wanted to think about what that land was like, it's crossed. If you want to represent those things with lines, then there's two sets of maps. And there's the maps, the white fella maps, and the black fella maps are something else again. And I thought, I'm going to write a book about two sets of maps. And that's, I think, in the end, it is what it is. But I still didn't know how to do it. I didn't really have any characters. I didn't know quite what was going to happen, and I didn't know how I was going to resolve it. Willie Barkhuber, and I think I can give this away. Willie, this is in Australia just after the Second World War. It is when and Willie's been young at that time. Willie thinks he's German, of course. He's got a Lutheran pastor father, and he doesn't really think he belongs in Australia. He feels sort of alienated from it, and so he thinks it's not his place. Talking to Australians, I think it's not an uncommon feeling for us to have felt, maybe because we came, we were immigrants and so on. But Willie's passionate, was romantic about maps of Germany, his grandmother's maps, so he falls in love with maps very early, and that extends to a broader interest, which ends up with him being the navigator in the trial. I meant to say something else now.
I don't know if you want to talk about indigenous maps and about how
yes.
they.
Well, I was trying to, but without. See, if you talk to Aboriginal people, they wouldn't regard those things as maps at all. They wouldn't use the term map to describe those things. So I did, and we can, if you like.
Well, I was like a map as a story, and sort of as a story as a map.
Yes, it
they're
is.
intertwined.
Yes.
I think.
I was really looking for the point. Not in that sense. Sorry, the point. Unfortunate pause. I was really looking for the point where, say, just out of Townsville, the redex route crosses the point where the giant bearded snake would have crossed the road. I was sort of looking for those sort of coincidences of myth and race, and spent an awful lot of time looking for them. And Catherine Wallen, who's a fabulous anthropologist who studies in the Kimberley region, drew maps and sent maps. I never ever found those sorts of points of intersection which I wanted. But still, you want to know something else? I can see it because you're waiting. What is it?
Oh, so I should prompt you.
Did you drift off?
Oh, sorry. But were you saying something? That's right. One thing, this is tangential, but it is something that I thought was really fascinating, which because we're talking about snakes. Willie has a dream where he's dreaming about a river, and he's talking to somebody who has different interpretations. One is the Freudian interpretation. This river is like a giant penis, and it's all about that. Or the river is the bearded snake, and it's a spiritual thing.
His friend thought the penis stuff was nonsense.
Right. No, absolutely. So I guess there are two kinds of European versus spiritual, maybe indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, his friend was became sort of like his imaginary father. He worked for him in the library. The friend was the curator of maps in the State Library of Victoria, and so on.
So maybe we could talk about, before we talk further, talk maybe about some of the characters, which So maybe there are, because also I because I want to ask you a question about father issues with the characters, because there's certainly they're not your father issues, or not. Like,
No,
let me
no.
tell you about my father. I've got issues. No,
Who knows?
but-
Who knows? But, you know, when I wrote the book, everyone said, well, of course, it's about fathers and sons. Clearly, you know, the whole book is. And I went, oh, is it?
Well,
so I think we do continually do that sort of thing.
Well, what I was going to rather cleverly make the connection between different colonialism and patriarchy, as that's one kind of
Yes.
fatherhood and
Yeah.
paternal approach, and then the more indigenous non-colonial as a different thing. But maybe we should.
But that works. It's good.
I was pretty chuffed,
Yeah.
personally, but so. Why don't we talk
Where
about the
were you
characters?
2 years ago?
Yeah, just waiting out on Facebook for people to like me, like always. So there's this race. There is a couple. There's who sign up for the race. It's Titch Bobs and his wife Irene. And as I said, they end up being car dealers.
Yes.
They live in Bacchus Marsh. And do you want to talk about the characters and maybe
Well,
a little bit about them?
maybe now's the time I should read
That would be
that little bit. Would that fit?
That would be excellent. Thank you.
I always think that reading from a novel is a really ill-advised thing, because when you write the novel, you really wish to transcend yourself. You don't wish what's on the page to be anything to do with you, in a sense, you know. So and that's the great adventure, and that's what the art's about, surely. And then you read your novel, and everyone says, I loved your reading so much. Now I know exactly how to read it and how it would sound. But in fact, I didn't want that at all, because I wanted the voices in your heads, to be free of the way I do this or whatever I do. However, whatever Oscar Wilde said,
That's a good answer for anything. Like just whatever Oscar Wilde said, yeah.
and to make it all a little worse, I'm going to read you from the opening of the book, and the voice is a female voice. So get your heads around that. And for a girl to defeat one father is a challenge, but there were two standing between me and what I wanted, which was not the fiddle-faddle, a lovely little fellow named Titch Bobs. The first father was my own. When he discovered that I, his teeny Irene, his little mouse, his petite-sized mademoiselle, had all by herself proposed matrimony to a man of 5'3", he spat his Wheaties in his plate. Titch's father was number 2. Well, he came out of the gate at a gallop, 100% in my favour. I was a beauty, a Bobby Dazzler, until in the hallway by the coat stand he gave me cause to slap his face. My sister was older and, as they say, more experienced. She could not see why I would want so small a husband. Did I plan to breed a team of mice? Ha, bloody ha. Beverly was 5'2.5" tall, and always breaking off engagements to lanky Lurch or gigantic Dino, or the famous football player whose name I am not ignorant enough to mention. I would have been afraid to shake his hand, forget the other business. Beverly made her bed and got what she might expect, i.e. 30-hour labours and heads as big as pumpkins. My own children were as tiny and perfect as their daddy, ideal in their proportions, in the lovely coordination of their limbs, in the pink Appel cheeks they inherited from Titch, the smile they got from me. My sister could not abide my happiness. she would spend years looking for evidence that it was somehow fake. When the first husband ran away to New Zealand, she wrote me a spiteful letter saying I was more interested in my husband than in my children. She said her boys were everything to her. She knew, she wrote, I only married Titch because of the money I could get from him. She was upset, of course. Why wouldn't she be? She'd married a bastard. She was divorced, she claimed, without a penny. So could she please go and live in the childhood home we had both inherited and whose sale she had always managed to impede? Could Titch and I have used the money? She didn't ask. Would it have changed our lives? Of course it would. I agreed on a peppercorn rent and kept my feelings to myself. Beverly liked to say that I was willful, which was an idea she got from Mum. But Mum liked me being willful. She got a real kick from seeing how I got my way. And of course, she was a bit the same, Mum. And she was blessed with such neat, level teeth and cheekbones, you would do anything to see her smile, even if you had to buy her a washing machine to make her do it. She got Dad to purchase the Ford, which was what brought Titch to our door in Geelong, Victoria, Australia. It was Victory in Europe Day, May the 8th, 1945. No one will ever know how Mum planned to utilise the Ford, drive down to Colac and see her sister after church. That was one story not even Dad could swallow. Didn't matter. He went on and wrote the cheque to the salesman, Dan Bobst, who, as I discovered when I opened the front door on VE Day, had thrown in free driving lessons, which would be supplied by his sonny. Oh Lord, what a sight that sonny was. There on a front porch with his cardboard suitcase on a Tuesday morning. I learned he was to stay with us. Poor Mum, alas, she never got to put the key in the ignition. And everyone was so upset and busy with the funeral, no one told the young man that he should leave. He had nowhere else to stay, so he unpacked his suitcase and awaited instructions, as he later liked to say. The Ford was parked in our drive with no sign that it was now a part of the estate. My mum was in Mount Dunedin Cemetery, and the new boarder was the only one who helped me go through her things. He said nothing about the car or about the lessons he had been expecting to give to the deceased. He asked me if I knew how to drive. I told him that if he could be home by 6 at night, he could have tea with us. In the midst of all the sadness, a pretty red-cheeked man was a great comfort. I could not do without. I held my breath. I cooked for him, and he scraped his plate clean and helped with the drying up. He was neat. When I cried, he comforted me. He left talcum powder on the bathroom floor. In the nights at Western Beach, when you could hear the forlorn anchor chains of the old warships anchored in Carey Bay, he told me stories of his father which he thought were funny. These were more important than I knew. In any case, my eyes stung hot to hear that the lovely boy had broken his arm swinging the prop of the wretched father's monoplane, and that the old bully had taught him to land by sitting behind him in the navigator's seat and thumping his slender back with his fist until he pushed the stick down sufficiently, and that he had abandoned him to stay with a pair of old Irish bachelors at Bullingarook until they had learned to drive their new Ford. The sonny was named Titch, although he was sometimes called Zack, which was what they used to call a sixpence, and a Zack was therefore half a shilling or half a bob, which was, of course, his father's name. Forget it. He was always Titch. God Jesus, and it seemed I was put on earth to love your tortured body and your impy, joyous soul. How could I predict, dear Beverly, what sort of life my heart's desire would lead me to? Our dad was still alive on the day I first set eyes on Titch. My babies were not yet born. I couldn't drive a car. We had not yet arrived at the era of Holden versus Ford. There was not even a redex around Australia reliability trial, although that, the greatest Australian car race of the century, is a story I will get to in the end.
Yeah. She's an amazing character. So the book is told in more or less alternating chapters. Her voice and Willie the Navigator that we spoke about. She's a woman in the 50s driving in a car race, and it seems to me that she's able to manage driving in the race, driving fast, being competent, being technically knowledgeable about cars, with compassion and understanding. And the men, they, for various reasons, they've got their own ideological agenda that cause them to drift off into less effective, being less effective people, less successful, and she's able to balance a lot of things despite a lot of losses, I think. So good, so marvelous, good work. So a question. So, and I know there was at least one woman, you refer to it in the book, that was actually historically in the redex trial.
Granny Conway.
Yeah.
Granny Conway was not going to get into that silly stuff all the men did. They stopped all their time, tinkering with their cars and just left it as the factory had set it. They'd be much better and they wouldn't have to be racing along all the time to make up lost time. So I'm not sure, she might have even taken a sewing machine with her, which so she could do womanly, things to make the media certainly loved her. She was. There were other women in the race, and there were husband and wife teams, but there wasn't anybody to base Irene on, nor would I. You don't need to if you've got.
Yeah, because I think also one of the things that you explore is attitudes towards maleness, which also means attitudes about how women should be and the limitations of what they're allowed to be. You describe the media critiquing. She's wearing overalls, and she's what would be the word? They didn't want her to be what she was to be, have such as agency as she did.
Her husband, who clearly loved her, until he went off in his own mad, particular, non-venal route, was sort of supported. But even he wanted her in Sydney to go off and buy a nice dress. Not to be wearing overalls, so that when the media came, the photographers came, she'd be wearing a nice dress.
Because they start with a very close relationship, and then because of this is the father issues. He's got a father, Dangerous Dan.
Well, she spent all her time. She really, really does love him. The problem with Titch is he's sort of been rather abused by his father. Titch's whole thing has been to release him from the spell of his father, and she's put up with the father. Dangerous Dan is a bully and a fantasist and all those sorts of things, and she feels like she has succeeded in doing it. And it seems indeed she has succeeded, and even when the race is on, and Dangerous Dan typically comes into the race to compete with his son. I mean, that's in an attempt to defeat his son in the race. Anyway, there's a certain something happens to Dan along the way, and Titch, whose obligation really should be at that moment probably primarily to his wife, stays with his father. And for Irene, that's sort of enough. And that's when there's sort of those big, serious misunderstandings that occur in relationships, or ways in which she's not understand the abused son's affection and connection with his father, and he's not really understood quite what his wife has been doing for him all these years.
So it seems like there's a model of what maleness should be like, and Dan follows it, and it seems like Titch is lured into that model, that there's this very strong pull, despite how much he loves his wife.
Maybe.
Oh, I mean, I think it's at least it's at play as to exactly what that is. I agree. So maybe we should talk about something else. We have to talk about something else. But no, let's talk about I want to talk about both the place of humor, because it's clearly...
thank you.
Clearly, it's fun. Yeah, it's clearly humor. It's a funny book, and humor is used as a technique. And I guess as a related question, the characters they're outsiders, and they're very stylized. Titch is a very small man. Irene's a very small woman.
Yeah.
They're slightly cartoonish, even though we care about them
Well,
a
the way
lot.
they arrive, it's certainly like that, isn't
Yes,
it? When
yes.
They both slide out on those little trolleys from underneath the car the first time Willie sees them, and they're sort of like perfect little creatures, and they're holding spanners, each one. And so they're sort of like figures in icons almost, and they do have that magical sort of quality about them. Yes, and that's when I thought, that's one of the many times you think when you're writing you've got a book. I thought, well, I've got a book there because of the way that pair is and how they look and their sort of magical quality. And I interrupted what you were saying to say that.
No, I was just going to ask about the place of humor and how their style, how humor functions, and also the stylization of the characters as part of that humor.
Well, I think the thing about the humor, I think a number of different things about it, but one I think is, you can listen to a conversation about this book, not necessarily this one, I'm not sure, but I think that you could listen to it and you could think of all the, one can talk about this book and the conversation can be filled with discussion of massacre, atrocity, and we could drift into that whole history of white colonization of this country, and the story is at one level incredibly bleak, right? And yet at the same time, it's actually that sort of conversation hides the fact that it's actually a very funny book. So how can you have a funny book which is sort of dealing with these sort of dark issues? I don't know, except that I always think humor's really important, and the darker it is, the more important the humor is, and that, I can't say anything that's sort of very optimistic about the future of our civilization, for instance. But maybe I could do it in a way that was funny. So there was I think the world's actually generally very dark, and I think we all are in a perilous situation. So we do need a bit of light, and I think the humour serves that purpose as well. Mm-hmm. And also there's just a thing that's like, somebody says, someone says to you, well, there you are, so why do you walk that way? I don't know why I walk that way, and I don't know why I write that way sometimes. So there's a thing about the role of humour in my work, which is I just keep doing it.
Right.
Maybe I've got one leg shorter than the other. I'm not sure, but it's.
But to me, a lot of your fiction is about connection and relationships and love, and I see and storytelling, and I see the humor is a way of engaging the readers. It is about, if we can tell a joke, if we can find this funny together, we have communion, we have a moment together. So even if it's dark, the world is dark, we are together telling that story, and you're listening to the story and you're laughing. I think that's an important function.
Yes, I agree with you. But I think also the characters tend to be passionate, rather highly energized, and continually misunderstanding where they are or really what's happening. And which is, that seems to me a pretty accurate sort of picture of life, or my life anyway. And so that often ends up, it's intrinsically a funny situation, to misunderstand the nature of your own reality and to be continually engaged with it.
No, absolutely. We're going to just we need to end soon for questions. But one thing I wanted to say about the approach to later on in the book. There's we referred to some of the Indigenous people, the stories that are funny and that are subversive and sort of speak, in a way, they speak truth to power. But they also they take a certain kind of power because there's knowledge. It's like an inside joke that's apparent that the white people are not getting.
Yes.
And so I think also
That's another
function.
Yes, absolutely. I
I think
agree.
that's important.
Yeah.